Welcome to the Stories That Shape Us podcast. The Stories That Shape Us is based on events and experiences that we've had in our lives and how they've impacted us, how they've shaped our lives, how they've shaped our decision making, and how it's impacting our lives in adulthood. Now, in this season of the podcast, this season meaning from now until the end of the year, we're going to talk about things that impacts us and impact the family. Now, there's one area of trauma that I haven't dealt with on the podcast since I've started this podcast 2 years ago, and it's financial trauma. And this season, I'm going to talk about a couple times in this season about how financial trauma has impacted our lives. Now, I have some guests that I'm going to show next week and the week after, and we're carrying on the conversation around how finances, how scarcity, growing up poor, the impact that it's had on our lives, and how it's impacting our children's lives, some of the psychological impact of financial trauma, and the things that you can do to heal, because healing is necessary. So what is financial trauma? Financial trauma is the emotional and psychological distress caused by negative financial experiences that significantly and had significant impact on our well-being. Now, sometimes I see people talk about growing up poor and how that is glamorized, and the fun that we have and the jokes that we do. But one of the things that I see in practice, in counseling practice, in talking to couples, through reading and research, is the deep, pervasive impact that financial trauma has on our lives, just as significant as any other form of trauma, just as significant as abandonment. And sometimes when financial trauma is coupled with neglect, it's coupled with emotional abandonment, it's coupled with abuse, it's coupled with attachment injuries, it really does have an impact on our lives. So in this episode of the podcast, I want to talk about some of the distortions that we develop as a result of growing up poor. Now, you may grow up in scarcity. You may have a scarcity mindset, and sometimes I see scarcity mindset going in both directions. Sometimes people become hoarders, where they have a lot and they never spend on themselves. They never buy necessary things that they need. Or sometimes people have and they give it away quickly because they can't stand to have it. Or sometimes people just repeat the cycle, and the cycle continues. But however it is that it's manifesting in your life, I want you to know that financial trauma can heal, and it can change your life, and it can change the lives of your children. And that's why we talk about the stories that shape us. And, sometimes these are not comfortable subjects to talk about, but we want to be able to, on this podcast, deal with the issues that affect our lives, that are silent issues. We want to talk about those silent issues, and financial trauma is one of those silent issues. So I want to talk about cognitive distortions, how financial trauma impact our thinking. And when it impacts our thinking, and it's so subtle that we don't realize that it's the trauma of growing up in scarcity and how it's impacted our thinking, and some of the things that we can do to change. So one of the distortions that I want to talk about is catastrophizing, the believing that the worst is the worst possible outcome around it. So if you think about your own financial situation, how have you catastrophized? Catastrophizing, we believe in the worst possible outcome. What's the outcome that you're requiring, and you're believing that it's never going to happen? So when we believe in the worst possible outcome, because when we were children, probably the worst happened. What was the worst that happened for you? Were you homeless? Did you have to go to bed without food? Were you didn't have clothes? Did you get bullied at school as a result of it? What was the worst possible outcome that you have? When I'm helping people to heal from any trauma, one of the things I like to use this example. Sometimes we watch things when we were children and it's scary. But as adults, when you watch the thing again, it's not as scary as it was when you were a child, and you wonder why were you afraid? Because when we were children, our brains are developing. We don't have the level of understanding that we have right now. And so the thing that happened, or the things that happened that made you believe the worst is possible, if you allow yourself to, whether it's in therapy, through reading, workshops, however you engage with that story, when you engage with that story, you will realize that it wasn't as, you can look at it through the eyes of adults. It was bad for the child, but as an adult looking at it, you can have information that is going to help you input it into your brain, and it will help you to understand that actually I can manage. Because that story, that worst possible outcome story, is impacting your spending. It's impacting whether you invest, whether you save. You're passing on that catastrophizing story to your children in ways that they're doing their own catastrophizing. It's impacting your relationships, because we know that divorce happened. One of the major reasons for divorce is money. And it's not money only because some people spend and some save. It's not as simple as that. Sometimes it's deeply rooted in trauma that one or both of those couples have experienced. And so money become an issue in the relationship. And so we want to be able to tackle catastrophizing. Also, is what we do is magnification. It's another distortion where we magnify the negatives, where it becomes so big, it's overwhelming, it's unmanageable. And because it's overwhelming and unmanageable, then we don't engage with it. And so I'm again encouraging you to engage with all aspects of your story, because the things that we experience impact the rest of our lives. Another one is emotional reasoning. Emotional reasoning, when you're believing what you think must be true. So you grew up poor, not having enough, and so the fear of being poor drives your decision making. The fear of being poor might drive the jobs that you go for. Sometimes you might go for jobs that means you have to work really hard, long hours, impacting your physical health, impacting your emotional health. It might mean that because it's affected your self-esteem, because the fear of being poor, because it is dictating your life, you're recreating that pattern in your life in so many ways. It affects your self-worth, that emotional reasoning. So it affects how you see yourself, how you see your family, and how you see other people. This fear also manifests in overspending, not buying goods or services that you need. The fear, the emotional reasoning might impact your mood, how you feel, how you think. It leads to anxiety, and it leads to depression, and it leads to other mental health crises. And do you know that people also experience post-traumatic symptoms based on financial trauma, growing up in scarcity? It might impact debt, living in recurring debt, living in a place of never having enough and always owing. It also manifests in hoarding, buying and having more than what you need, and denying yourself some of the things that you need. Now, here's a way to start healing from that. Proverbs 3, verse 5-6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all of your heart and lean not unto your own understanding. In all of your ways, acknowledge him, and he shall direct your path." Now, trusting in the Lord in this instance, or just doesn't mean not planning. It doesn't mean not having financial literacy or learning it. It doesn't mean not facing the distortions and tackling them through therapy or through books or financial education. It doesn't mean that. It means that you're going to trust God to help you to release the distortions that you have, to release the distortions that you have around money. It means that you're going to trust him to hold your hand while you learn about money, while you learn about budgeting, while you put a plan in place, and while you're incrementally healing this wound that was created through growing up in scarcity. That's how you trust him. And although trust is often a challenge for people who experience trauma, learning to trust God daily with this area of our life is going to create lasting and significant changes. There's a book that I read that you might find useful and helpful. And I talk about it in one of the episodes that I'm going to air soon. And it's called The Richest Man in Babylon. That has been a life-changing book. But as I was reading it, if you're a Christian, and most of us here are Christians, the Bible gives us so much financial literacy. But when you have experienced financial trauma, or when you don't have financial education, you don't know how to see what is in the Bible and the principles that are there that are meant to help you, right? And so When you read that book, it's a small book, really easy to read. You literally can sit and read it in a couple of hours, maybe 2 hours, 3 hours at the most, you know? So grab a nice cup of tea, get that book and read it. You can get it on Amazon for less than £1 sometimes on Kindle. So grab that book, a cup of tea, and read it. And I'm encouraging people to read that book with the book of Proverbs, because Proverbs talks about wisdom. Solomon talks about wisdom. And in the first 10 chapters of Proverbs, I think it's almost a definition of what wisdom is and who wisdom is. And then the next couple of chapters, it's about how to implement the wisdom that Solomon talked about. And when I discovered that, it really blew my mind that here is definition and implementation. So if you're struggling, if you've experienced financial trauma, it's creating havoc in your life. You cannot see any way out. You are depressed, you're anxious, it's creating problems in your relationships, and you are becoming not only heartsick, but mentally you're being challenged because of it. The story around scarcity has permeated itself throughout the rest of your life. The stories that you learn about yourself because of how you grew up and the scarcity that you grew up in has impacted your entire life. It has told you things about yourself that isn't true. It's told you you can't do things that other people do. It's told you, it's impacted your self-worth to the extent that you're not using your gifts and talents, that you don't believe that you have gifts and talents that are worthy of use. This story around financial trauma has taken from you things that God has given you. You know, he said he has created you fearfully and wonderfully. He said he has given you gifts and talents that your gifts will make room for you and put you before kings. But financial trauma may have taken so much of your self-worth that you do not believe that about yourself. But healing is possible. Sit with the book of Proverbs, prayerfully with your journal, and as you read through and journal and ask God questions about who you are, use that as a means to discover truly who you are, and let the stories that financial trauma has told you, God will recreate that and rewrite your story so that the story that you continue to tell yourself from this day forward will be very different. And the stories that your children learn about themselves will be different because you have taken the time to do the work of healing, because healing is possible. Thank you for joining me in this episode of Stories That Shape Us. I hope you'll join me on the next story.